In the gentle morning mist of May 1536, the Tower of London stood as both fortress and prison, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of triumph and tragedy. Within these walls, a remarkable woman awaited her fate with a dignity that would echo through the corridors of history. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, once the beloved of a king who had torn apart the very fabric of Christendom for her sake, now found herself counting down her final hours on earth. The spring air carried with it the scent of blooming flowers from the Tower gardens, a cruel reminder of the world that continued to flourish beyond these confining walls. Anne had been here before, but under vastly different circumstances. She had arrived at the Tower in triumph just 3 years earlier, on the eve of her coronation, when the bells of London had rung out in celebration of their new queen. Now, those same stones would witness her final chapter. As dawn broke on May 18, 1536, Anne Boleyn stirred in her chamber within the Queen's house at the Tower. The rooms that had once been prepared for her as a triumphant queen now served as her prison, though they were furnished with a certain dignity befitting her royal status. The irony was not lost on her that she would meet her end in the same place where she had prepared for her greatest moment of glory. Her attendants, Lady Kingston, and her other ladies-in-waiting, moved quietly about the chamber. These women, some who had served her during her days of power, now bore witness to her fall. There was a profound sadness in their movements, a recognition that they were attending to a queen for the final time. Anne herself maintained a composure that astonished all who observed her, as if she had found some inner peace in accepting her destiny. The night before, Anne had spoken with remarkable clarity about her situation. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she had remarked to her attendants, "and I have a little neck." She had even laughed at this, placing her hands around her slender throat in a gesture that would be remembered by all who witnessed. This ability to find humor in her darkest hour spoke to the extraordinary character of this woman, who had risen from minor nobility to the very pinnacle of power. Through the narrow window of her chamber, Anne could see the scaffold that had been erected on Tower Green. Unlike the usual crude wooden platform used for common criminals, this scaffold was built with boards and covered with black cloth, acknowledgement of her royal status even in death. The sight of it might have filled another person with terror, but Anne regarded it with a strange sense of relief. Her torment was almost at an end. The events that had led to this moment seemed almost impossible to believe. Just months earlier, Anne had been the Queen of England, mother to the future Elizabeth I, wife to the most powerful monarch in Europe. Her rise had been meteoric, her fall even more dramatic. The very qualities that had captivated Henry VIII, her wit, her intelligence, her refusal to become merely another royal mistress, had ultimately contributed to her downfall. Henry's infatuation with Anne had begun in the early 1520s, when she was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Unlike her sister Mary, who had readily become the king's mistress, Anne had held herself aloof. She had understood instinctively that to capture a king's lasting attention, she must remain just beyond his reach. "I beseech your highness most earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two," she had written to Henry in one of their early exchanges, maintaining the delicate balance between encouragement and reserve. Their courtship had been conducted largely through letters, passionate missives that revealed the depth of Henry's obsession. "I pray you to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us," Henry had written, his usually commanding tone transformed into that of a supplicant. These letters, which would later be preserved in the Vatican archives, painted the picture of a king transformed by love into something approaching an ordinary man, vulnerable and uncertain. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across Anne's chamber. She had slept little, but not from fear. Rather, she seemed possessed by a nervous energy, a need to ensure that every detail of her final hours was conducted with the dignity befitting a Queen of England. She had requested that her execution be carried out by a swordsman from Calais, rather than the traditional axe-wielding headsman of the Tower. This was both a mercy, the sword was quicker, and more certain, and a final assertion of her elevated status. Anne's thoughts drifted to her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old,
who had been declared illegitimate by the same parliament that had once celebrated her parents' marriage. The child was at Hunsdon House, far from the horror that was about to unfold, cared for by devoted servants who loved their small charge, despite the cloud that now hung over her birth. Anne had written a final letter to her daughter, though it's unclear whether Elizabeth would ever receive it. In it she had tried to explain the inexplicable, to leave some final words of love and guidance for a child who would grow up never truly knowing her mother. The charges that had brought Anne to this place seemed almost fantastical in their scope and audacity. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, treason against the king's person, conspiracy to bring about the king's death. These accusations, brought forward with suspicious speed and tried with unseemly haste, had been enough to condemn not only Anne but also the men allegedly involved in her crimes. The trials had been a mockery of justice, conducted with a predetermined outcome. Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had presided over her trial, his face a mask of grim duty as he condemned his own niece to death. When asked how she pleaded to the charges, Anne had stood tall and declared, "Not guilty," her voice carrying clearly through the great hall despite the weight of the accusations against her. She had defended herself with intelligence and dignity, addressing each charge with reasoned argument, but the verdict had been decided before she ever entered the courtroom. Her brother George had been tried separately, facing not only the charge of adultery with his sister, but also accusations of mocking the king and discussing his potential death. George Boleyn was a man of considerable wit and learning, and he had conducted his defense with the same intelligence that ran in the Boleyn family. When presented with a piece of paper and asked to read it aloud, a document that reportedly contained scandalous remarks about the king's virility, George had instead read it silently and refused to speak the words aloud, showing consideration for Henry's reputation even as he faced death. As the morning progressed, Anne requested that she be allowed to receive communion one final time. This was granted, and she knelt in prayer with a devotion that impressed even her guards. Her faith had been a constant source of strength throughout her ordeal. She had embraced the Reformed religion with genuine conviction, not merely as a political convenience, and she faced death with the certainty of one who believed in divine providence and eternal salvation. The other condemned men had already met their fate. Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton had been executed on Tower Hill, their heads displayed on spikes as a warning to any who might consider betraying their king. George Boleyn, as a nobleman, had been granted the privilege of beheading rather than the hanging, drawing and quartering reserved for common traitors. Only Anne remained, her execution delayed by a day to allow the executioner from Calais to arrive. Anne's ladies helped her dress for the final time as queen. She chose her clothing carefully, a gray damask gown with a low neckline, over which she wore an ermine mantle that proclaimed her royal status to the end. Her hair was bound up and hidden beneath a coif, in preparation for the executioner's work. Around her neck she wore a small pendant containing a portrait of her daughter Elizabeth, a final connection to the life she was leaving behind. The delay in her execution had given Anne additional time to contemplate her fate, and she had used these hours to compose herself with remarkable grace. She spoke to her ladies about practical matters, the disposal of her few remaining possessions, messages to be carried to friends and family. She distributed small gifts among her attendants, tokens of gratitude for their loyal service during her darkest hours. "Master Kingston," she said to the constable of the Tower, "I hear I shall not die afore noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time and past my pain." Her impatience to face her fate spoke not of a death wish, but of a desire to end the uncertainty and psychological torment of waiting. The courage she displayed in these final hours became legendary among those who witnessed it. The politics that had led to Anne's downfall were as complex as they were ruthless. Henry's passion for Anne had cooled considerably by 1536, replaced by his infatuation with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane represented everything Anne was not: quiet, submissive, traditional in her piety and her approach to queenship. Where Anne had challenged and stimulated Henry intellectually,
Jane offered the peaceful domesticity that the king now craved. Anne's final pregnancy had ended in miscarriage in January 1536, and with it died Henry's hopes for a male heir from their union. The lost child, reportedly male, represented not just personal tragedy but political catastrophe. Henry's break with Rome, his defiance of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, his separation from his first wife, Catherine, all of this had been justified by his need for a legitimate male heir. Anne's inability to provide this had made her not just dispensable but dangerous to Henry's vision of his legacy. The faction that had risen with Anne, her father Thomas Boleyn, her uncle Norfolk, her allies at court, had begun to distance themselves as her position weakened. In the treacherous world of Tudor politics, loyalty was always conditional, and the Boleyns had made many enemies during their years of ascendancy. Now those enemies saw their opportunity for revenge, and they pressed it ruthlessly. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had orchestrated much of Anne's downfall. His motivations were complex, partly personal animosity following disagreements over policy, partly his recognition that Anne had become a liability to the king he served so faithfully. Cromwell had constructed the case against Anne with legal precision, weaving together circumstantial evidence, gossip and forced confessions to create a narrative of guilt that would satisfy the king's need for justification. The speed with which events had unfolded was breathtaking. The first arrests had been made on May 1st, during the May Day festivities at Greenwich Palace. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, had been taken and tortured into confessing an adulterous relationship with the Queen. Within days, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston had been arrested. Then came George Boleyn, and finally Anne herself. Anne's arrest had taken place at Greenwich Palace, where she had been summoned to meet with members of the Privy Council. She had been told that she was to be taken to the Tower to await trial, and she had famously replied, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, I am ready to obey." Even in this moment of ultimate crisis, she had maintained the composure expected of a queen. The journey to the Tower by barge along the Thames had been conducted with dignity, though Anne had been accompanied by guards and her movements restricted. As the familiar landmarks of London passed by, the great houses along the riverbank, the bustling wharfs and markets, Anne must have reflected on how different this journey was from her triumphant procession to her coronation just 3 years earlier. Upon her arrival at the Tower, Anne had been lodged in the same apartments she had occupied before her coronation. The constable, Sir William Kingston, had been charged with her care, and he had carried out his duties with courtesy though firmness. Kingston would later report to Cromwell on Anne's behavior and statements, providing valuable insights into her mental state during these final days. Anne's conversations during her imprisonment revealed both her terror and her remarkable resilience. She spoke often of her innocence, maintaining to the end that she had never betrayed her marriage vows. "I can say no more, but nay, without I should open my body," she declared when questioned about the charge. This phrase, with its implicit reference to physical examination to prove her virtue, demonstrated both her desperation to be believed and her understanding of the intimate nature of the accusations against her. The nights in the Tower were the hardest for Anne. Despite her daytime composure, darkness brought with it the full weight of her situation. Her ladies reported that she would sometimes wake crying, calling out for her daughter or speaking of her fears for Elizabeth's future. These glimpses of vulnerability made her courage during the daylight hours all the more remarkable. Religious consolation played a crucial role in Anne's final days. She had always been devout, though her faith had led her toward the reformed religion that Henry had embraced in his break from Rome. Now facing death, she found comfort in prayer, and in the certainty that her suffering would soon end. She spoke of her readiness to meet her Maker, expressing confidence that divine justice would ultimately prevail even if earthly justice had failed her. The question of Anne's guilt or innocence would be debated by historians for centuries to come. The evidence presented against her was largely circumstantial, based on court gossip and the suspicious coincidence of private meetings with the accused men. The speed of the trials and the obvious political motivation behind them cast serious doubt on their validity. Most modern historians believe Anne was innocent of the charges, a victim of Henry's need to remarry, and his growing paranoia about threats to his authority.
Anne's intelligence and education had always set her apart at court. She spoke French fluently, had some knowledge of Latin, and was well versed in literature and music. Her library at Hever Castle had contained works of religious reform that were considered radical for their time. This intellectual sophistication had initially attracted Henry, but may ultimately have worked against her, making her seem dangerous to those who preferred their queens to be silent and decorative. The relationship between Anne and Henry had been passionate but tumultuous from the beginning. Their courtship letters revealed deep affection, but also the constant tension of trying to maintain interest across years of separation and uncertainty. "No more to you at this time, but that I pray God send you good health," Henry had written in one of his early letters, the formal closing belying the passionate content that preceded it. Anne's wit had been legendary at court. She had possessed a sharp tongue, and had not hesitated to use it, even against the king when she felt wronged. This boldness had excited Henry initially, but had become increasingly problematic as their marriage settled into more mundane paths. Queens were expected to be deferential. Anne had never learned to be anything but herself. The international implications of Anne's execution were significant. Her death would be seen across Europe as evidence of Henry's instability and cruelty. Catherine of Aragon's supporters would view it as divine justice, while reformers would mourn the loss of one of their most prominent advocates. The Pope would see it as an opportunity to attempt reconciliation with England, though Henry's subsequent marriage to Jane Seymour would quickly dash any such hopes. Anne's family had largely abandoned her by the time of her trial. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, made no public effort to save her, perhaps recognizing that such an attempt would only ensure his own destruction. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth, had died several years earlier, sparing her the agony of witnessing her daughter's fate. Only George had remained loyal to the end, and he had paid for that loyalty with his own life. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Anne's execution had been scheduled for noon, and she began to prepare herself mentally for the ordeal ahead. She asked her ladies to pray for her soul, and to remember her kindly after she was gone. She spoke of her hope that her daughter Elizabeth would one day understand the circumstances that had led to this tragedy. The executioner from Calais had arrived during the night, bringing with him the sharp sword that would end Anne's life. He was said to be skilled in his craft, able to complete his work with a single swift stroke. This was a mercy that Anne had specifically requested, and one that Henry had granted as a final gesture of the love they had once shared. Anne's last meal was simple: some bread, a little wine, perhaps some fruit. She ate sparingly, more from necessity than appetite. Food held no interest for her now. Her thoughts were focused entirely on the spiritual preparation for what was to come. She spent considerable time in prayer, reading from her prayer book, and speaking quietly with the chaplain who had been assigned to provide her with religious comfort. The Tower officials began to make their final preparations. Word was sent to notify the small group of witnesses who would be present at the execution. Unlike public executions on Tower Hill, Anne's death would be witnessed by only a select few members of the Privy Council, the Lord Mayor of London, and representatives of the foreign ambassadors who maintained residences in the city. Anne asked to see the sword that would be used, and this request was granted. She examined it carefully, running her finger along the blade and testing its sharpness. "It will not hurt. It is so little," she commented, referring again to her slender neck. This ability to discuss the instrument of her death with such composure amazed all who heard it. The psychological pressure of these final hours was immense. Anne knew that her every word and gesture was being observed and would be reported to the king and his council. She was conscious that she was playing out her final role on the stage of history, and she was determined to perform it with dignity. Her reputation and perhaps the future prospects of her daughter might depend on how courageously she faced her end. Letters had been arriving throughout the morning from various European courts, some expressing horror at the proceedings, others offering diplomatic support for Henry's actions. The imperial ambassador, Chapuis, who had always been hostile to Anne, would later report that she had died bravely. Even her enemies acknowledged the grace with which she faced her fate.
Anne's servants worked quietly to pack her few remaining possessions. Most of her jewelry and fine clothing had already been confiscated or redistributed, but she still had some personal items that she wished to be given to specific people. A small crucifix was to go to one of her ladies, a book of prayers to another. These final acts of generosity were typical of the woman who had always been concerned with the welfare of those who served her. The morning prayers in the Tower Chapel could be heard drifting across the courtyard. Anne listened to the familiar Latin words, finding comfort in their timeless rhythm. She had participated in these same prayers countless times during her happy days as queen, never imagining that she would one day hear them for the final time from a prison cell. A message arrived from the king, not a reprieve but a formal notification that the execution would proceed as scheduled. Henry had apparently wrestled with the decision up to the last moment, but his need to marry Jane Seymour and legitimize any children from that union had ultimately overcome any lingering affection for his second wife. Anne received the news without visible emotion, merely nodding to acknowledge that she understood. The crowd that had gathered outside the tower walls was smaller than might have been expected. News of the execution had spread quickly through London, but many people seemed reluctant to celebrate the death of someone who had once been their queen. Anne had never been popular with the common people who had remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon, but there was something disturbing about the rapid fall of someone who had so recently been at the pinnacle of power. Anne's hair, which had once been her crowning glory, was now hidden beneath the plain coif that would make the executioner's work easier. She had always been vain about her appearance, and this final sacrifice of her beauty was perhaps one of the more difficult aspects of preparing for death. Yet she bore even this indignity with grace, understanding that earthly vanity had no place in her final hours. The sound of construction work could be heard from Tower Green as the final adjustments were made to the scaffold. The platform had been built lower than usual, allowing Anne to kneel rather than having to place her head on a traditional block. This was another concession to her royal status and to the method of execution that had been chosen. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had pronounced Anne's marriage to Henry valid, had visited her the previous day to offer spiritual counsel. Their conversation had remained private, but it was reported that Anne had shown no sign of despair or loss of faith. She had spoken of her confidence in divine mercy and her belief that she would soon be at peace. The political ramifications of Anne's death were already becoming clear. Jane Seymour was being prepared for her role as Henry's third wife, with the wedding planned for the day after Anne's execution. This unseemly haste demonstrated the purely practical nature of Henry's approach to marriage and kingship. Love had given way entirely to political necessity. Anne's thoughts turned often to her coronation just 3 years past, but seeming like a lifetime ago. She remembered the procession through London, the crowds calling out their good wishes, the weight of the crown upon her head. She had been 6 months pregnant with Elizabeth then, full of hope for the future, and confident in her husband's love. The contrast with her present situation was almost too painful to contemplate. The morning sun was now high enough to cast light directly into Anne's chamber. She stood at the window, looking out at the world she was about to leave. The Thames flowed past as it always had, carrying boats full of people going about their daily business, oblivious to the drama playing out within the tower walls. Life would continue after she was gone, indifferent to her fate. Word came that the executioner was ready to proceed. Anne nodded calmly and began her final preparations. She removed her hurry and placed it carefully in a small casket to be distributed according to her wishes. She embraced each of her ladies in turn, thanking them for their loyalty and asking them to pray for her soul. The walk from her chamber to the scaffold would be brief, but significant. Anne knew that she would be observed every step of the way, and she was determined to maintain her composure. She had prepared a short speech to deliver before her execution, as was customary for condemned nobles. The words had been carefully chosen to avoid giving further offense to the king, while still maintaining her dignity. Anne's final prayer was offered privately, kneeling beside her bed in the chamber that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. She prayed for her daughter's future, for her own soul, and for the forgiveness of those who had brought her to this place. When she rose, her face was calm and resolved. The time had come to fulfill her final duty as a queen, to die with courage and grace. The great bell of the tower began to toll, its deep notes echoing across London and announcing to the city that the moment had arrived. Anne straightened her shoulders, checked her appearance one final time in the small mirror that had been left in her chamber, and moved toward the door. Her ladies fell into step behind her, their faces wet with tears that their mistress refused to shed. The corridors of the tower seemed longer than usual as Anne made her way toward Tower Green. Her footsteps echoed off the stone walls, a sound that would haunt the memories of those who accompanied her on this final journey. Guards stood at attention as she passed, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying the gravity of the moment. As Anne emerged into the morning sunlight, she could see the small crowd of official witnesses gathered around the black-draped scaffold. The executioner stood ready, his sword gleaming in the light. Sir William Kingston waited to escort her to the platform, his expression grave but respectful. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the final act in the tragedy that had begun with love and ended in destruction. The morning air was fresh and sweet, filled with the promise of a beautiful spring day that Anne would not live to see complete. She paused for a moment, drawing a deep breath and looking around at the ancient stones of the tower, the blue sky above, the faces of those who had come to witness her death. Then, with the same grace that had first attracted a king and later sealed her fate, Anne Boleyn began her final walk to the scaffold, ready to meet her destiny with the courage that had defined her remarkable life. The small procession moved slowly across Tower Green, each step measured and deliberate. Anne walked with her head held high, her bearing still regal despite the circumstance. Behind her, her ladies-in-waiting struggled to maintain their composure, their quiet sobs the only sound that broke the morning's stillness. The weight of history pressed down upon this moment, as everyone present understood they were witnessing the end of an era that had changed England forever. Sir William Kingston walked beside Anne, his role as her guardian extending to these final moments. He had served as constable of the tower for many years and had overseen numerous executions, but none had affected him quite like this one. Anne's courage and dignity throughout her imprisonment had earned his reluctant admiration, and he found himself hoping that her end would be swift and merciful. The scaffold stood waiting, its black drapery fluttering gently in the morning breeze. The platform was perhaps 4 feet high, surrounded by straw to absorb the blood that would soon flow. The block where Anne would kneel was covered with black velvet, a final acknowledgement of her royal status. Everything had been prepared with careful attention to the protocols that governed such solemn occasions. Among the witnesses gathered around the scaffold stood Thomas Cromwell, the man who had orchestrated much of Anne's downfall. His face was impassive, but those who knew him well might have detected a trace of satisfaction in his eyes. This execution represented the successful completion of a complex political maneuver that had required months of careful planning and manipulation. For Cromwell, Anne's death was not a tragedy, but a necessary step in securing the king's future. The Duke of Norfolk was also present, his face a mask of grim duty. As Anne's uncle, he might have been expected to show some emotion at this moment, but he had long ago learned to separate family loyalty from political survival. His presence here served to legitimize the proceedings and demonstrate that even Anne's own relatives accepted the justice of her sentence. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, watched from a position near the scaffold. He had been Catherine of Aragon's most faithful supporter throughout the king's great matter, and he viewed Anne's execution as a form of divine justice. Yet even he would later write that Anne had conducted herself with remarkable courage and dignity in these final moments, earning a grudging respect from one who had been her bitter enemy. The Lord Mayor of London stood with the other civic officials, their presence lending additional authority to the proceedings. They represented the city that had once celebrated Anne's coronation with pageants and festivities, but which had never fully embraced her as their queen. Now they bore witness to her end, their faces reflecting the somber mood that had settled over the assembled crowd. The executioner from Calais stood ready, his sword resting point down on the scaffold. He was a professional, skilled in his craft, who took pride in delivering a clean, swift death. His presence was itself a mark of respect for Anne's status. Common criminals faced the crude acts of the Tower's regular headsman, but queens merited the services of a master swordsman. As Anne approached the scaffold, she could see the faces of those who had come to witness her death. Some showed curiosity, others satisfaction, but many reflected a kind of horrified fascination at the spectacle of a queen's execution. This was unprecedented in English history. Never before had a crowned and anointed Queen of England been put to death by judicial sentence. Anne paused at the foot of the scaffold steps, gathering herself for this final ordeal. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times during the long nights in the Tower, imagining how she would behave, what she would say, how she would maintain her dignity to the end. Now the moment had arrived, and she found herself surprisingly calm, as if all the fear and uncertainty had burned away, leaving only resolve. The steps to the scaffold were steep, and Anne gathered her skirts carefully as she climbed. Her movements were graceful and controlled, betraying no sign of the terror that surely filled her heart. Behind her, her ladies followed, their own faces pale with anguish, but their loyalty unwavering even in this darkest hour. Upon reaching the platform, Anne stood for a moment surveying the scene. The crowd of witnesses seemed small and insignificant compared to the thousands who had cheered her coronation, but she understood that their testimony would carry her final performance to the world. History would judge her not only by her life, but by the manner of her death, and she was determined that judgment would find her worthy. Sir William Kingston stepped forward to formally announce the proceeding. "Anne Boleyn, lately Queen of England," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "You have been lawfully tried and condemned to death. Have you any last words to speak before the sentence is carried out?" His tone was respectful but official, acknowledging her former rank while emphasizing the finality of her situation. Anne nodded and stepped forward to address the small assembly. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, carrying the authority she had wielded as queen. "Good Christian people," she began, using the traditional opening for a scaffold speech, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Her words were carefully chosen to avoid any direct challenge to the king's justice, while still maintaining her dignity. She understood that any statement that could be construed as treasonous would reflect poorly on her memory and might endanger those who had served her faithfully. Even in death she sought to protect others from the consequences of association with her. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you," Anne continued, "for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words, praising the man who had condemned her to death, demonstrated either remarkable magnanimity or shrewd political calculation, perhaps both. They ensured that no one could accuse her of dying with treasonous words on her lips. The irony of praising Henry's mercy while standing on a scaffold was not lost on the witnesses, but Anne's tone remained sincere and respectful. She had loved this man once, deeply and passionately, and perhaps some remnant of that feeling survived even now. More practically, she understood that her daughter's future might depend on maintaining the fiction of Henry's benevolence and justice. "And if any person will meddle of my cause," Anne went on, "I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." With these words, she addressed the question of her guilt or innocence as diplomatically as possible, asking for charitable judgment while avoiding any direct assertion of her innocence that might anger the king. Anne then turned to her attendants, embracing each of them one final time. "Pray for me," she whispered to each woman, her voice finally betraying some of the emotion she had kept so carefully controlled. These women had served her faithfully through her rise and fall, and their loyalty in these final hours meant more to her than all the pageantry of her coronation. Lady Boleyn, one of her attendants, who shared her family name though was not a close relative, helped Anne remove her headdress and the upper part of her gown, leaving her in a simple gray kirtle. Her long dark hair, once her pride, was bound up tightly to expose her slender neck. The physical preparation for execution was perhaps the most degrading part of the entire process, reducing a queen to the status of any common criminal.
Anne knelt down and began to pray, her lips moving silently as she commended her soul to God's mercy. The assembled witnesses watched in respectful silence as she prepared herself spiritually for what was to come. Her faith, which had sustained her through the long months of uncertainty, now provided comfort in these final moments. The executioner stepped forward, his sword now raised and ready. He was experienced enough to know that timing was crucial. The condemned person must be distracted at the moment of the blow to ensure they did not flinch or move, which could result in a messy, prolonged death. "Where is my sword?" he called out suddenly, looking away from Anne toward his assistant. Anne turned her head instinctively toward the sound of his voice, and in that instant, the sword descended in a perfect arc. The blow was clean and swift, separating her head from her body in a single stroke. The executioner had fulfilled his promise of a merciful death, and Anne's suffering was ended in an instant. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, as if the finality of what they had witnessed required time to fully comprehend. Then, slowly, the normal sounds of life began to return. The distant calls of merchants in the city, the lapping of the Thames against the tower walls, the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Anne's ladies-in-waiting wept openly now, their composure finally breaking as they knelt beside the scaffold. One of them, with trembling hands, wrapped Anne's head in a white cloth, treating the remains of their mistress with the same reverence they had shown her in life. Their loyalty had not ended with death, and they would ensure that even these final duties were performed with dignity. Sir William Kingston supervised the removal of Anne's body, which was placed in a crude elm chest that happened to be available. No proper coffin had been prepared for a queen's burial. This final indignity perhaps summed up the hasty, improvised nature of the entire proceeding. Everything had been organized to serve Henry's immediate needs, with little thought given to the historical significance of what was transpiring. The witnesses began to disperse, each carrying with them the memory of what they had seen. Some would write accounts of the execution that would survive for centuries, ensuring that Anne's courage in death would be remembered long after the political circumstances that had brought her to the scaffold were forgotten. Others would keep their memories private, perhaps understanding that they had witnessed something that would change the course of English history.
Thomas Cromwell lingered for a moment, observing as the scaffold was dismantled and the evidence of the morning's work was cleared away. His satisfaction was tempered by a kind of professional respect for how smoothly the proceedings had gone. There had been no unseemly scenes, no last-minute confessions or recantations that might have complicated the king's position. Anne had played her final role perfectly. The news of Anne's execution spread quickly through London, and then throughout England and Europe. Church bells did not ring out in celebration as they had for her coronation. This was not an occasion for public rejoicing, but rather a solemn reminder of the price of opposing royal will. The speed with which the news traveled demonstrated the intense interest that Anne's fate had generated across the civilized world. In the royal palace at Whitehall, King Henry received word of his wife's death with apparent equanimity. He had already begun preparations for his wedding to Jane Seymour, which would take place in just 10 days' time. The king's ability to move so quickly from the execution of one wife to marriage with another demonstrated the purely practical nature of his approach to matrimony and kingship. Jane Seymour herself received the news in private, perhaps with mixed emotions. She had known Anne personally, having served as one of her ladies-in-waiting before capturing the king's attention. Now Anne's death had cleared the way for Jane's elevation to the throne, but it had also provided a stark reminder of how quickly royal favor could turn to royal wrath. The imperial ambassador immediately dispatched reports to his master, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, describing the day's events in detail. These dispatches would become important historical documents, providing objective accounts of Anne's final hours from the perspective of a skilled diplomatic observer. Chapuis wrote that Anne had died with courage and dignity, words that carried particular weight coming from one who had been her enemy. The Pope in Rome received the news with satisfaction, viewing Anne's death as divine punishment for her role in England's break with the Catholic Church. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered in St. Peter's Basilica, and there was talk of restoring England to the Catholic fold now that the primary obstacle to reconciliation had been removed. These hopes would prove premature, as Henry's religious policies continued unchanged despite Anne's death. The French court, where Anne had spent part of her youth and which had generally supported her cause, received the news with dismay. King Francis I had maintained cordial relations with Henry despite their religious differences, but the execution of a queen was seen as a disturbing precedent that might have implications for royal marriages throughout Europe. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, received word of his daughter's death at his estate in Kent. His reaction went unrecorded, but it must have been devastating to lose both his son and daughter within days of each other. The Boleyn family's meteoric rise to power had ended in complete catastrophe, with Thomas himself stripped of most of his honors and forced into obscurity. The common people of London reacted to the news with mixed emotion. Anne had never been popular among the masses, who had remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon throughout the divorce proceedings. Yet there was something disturbing about the execution of a queen, and many began to whisper that Henry's actions were becoming increasingly tyrannical and unpredictable. In the Tower, Anne's body was hastily buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, the small church within the fortress walls where many notable prisoners had been laid to rest. No elaborate funeral was held, no monument erected to mark her passing. She was interred in an unmarked grave, her remains treated with no more ceremony than those of a common criminal. The chapel where Anne was buried had a long and tragic history. Many of those who had fallen from royal favor lay beneath its floors, including her own brother George, who had been buried there just days earlier. The building itself seemed to embody the precarious nature of life at the Tudor court, where today's favorite could become tomorrow's victim with frightening speed. The afternoon sun streamed through the chapel windows as Anne's simple funeral service was conducted. Only a handful of people attended: her ladies-in-waiting, some Tower officials, and the chaplain who performed the burial rites. There were no elaborate rituals, no state funeral processions, nothing to mark the passing of a woman who had once been the most powerful person in England, after the king himself. The political implications of Anne's death continued to reverberate throughout the day, and the days that followed. Parliament was summoned to pass acts legitimizing Henry's upcoming marriage to Jane Seymour and bastardizing his daughter Elizabeth, just as they had previously bastardized his daughter Mary. The machinery of government moved with mechanical efficiency to adjust to the new reality. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was now officially illegitimate, her claim to the throne theoretically void. She remained at Hunsdon House under the care of devoted servants, too young to understand the momentous changes that had just altered her life forever. The little girl who had been born a princess was now legally nobody, her future dependent entirely on her father's whims and the uncertain fortunes of politics. The household that had served Anne as queen was swiftly disbanded, its members scattered to new positions or left to find their own way in a world that had suddenly changed around them. Some would find places in Jane Seymour's service, others would retire from court life entirely. All would carry with them memories of the remarkable woman they had served during her brief but eventful reign. The Boleyn family's enemies wasted no time in pressing their advantage. Properties were seized, positions redistributed, and old scores settled as the political landscape shifted to accommodate the new reality. The faction that had risen with Anne found themselves suddenly vulnerable, their future prospects dependent on their ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The international implications of Anne's execution would continue to unfold over the coming months and years. Her death was seen as evidence of English instability and Henry's increasing isolation from mainstream European opinion. The king, who had once been viewed as a Renaissance prince, was now seen by many as a dangerous tyrant, unpredictable in his affections and ruthless in his treatment of those who crossed him. Yet even as the political consequences played out, the human tragedy of Anne's story began to take on a different character. In death she began to be remembered not as the scheming temptress of Catholic propaganda or the political liability she had become to Henry, but as a woman of courage who had faced an unjust fate with remarkable dignity. The manner of her death began to rehabilitate her reputation in ways that her life had never achieved. The May evening brought with it a gentle rain that seemed to wash away the last traces of the morning's grim proceeding. Tower Green was once again an empty courtyard, giving no sign of the drama that had unfolded there just hours earlier. The ancient stones had witnessed many such scenes over the centuries and would witness many more, but few would be remembered with such clarity or generate such lasting controversy. As night fell over London, the city settled into an uneasy quiet. The execution of a queen was not something that happened every day, and people struggled to understand what it meant for their kingdom's future. Some whispered that this was the beginning of a new age of royal tyranny. Others that it was simply the unfortunate but necessary end to a troubled marriage. History would ultimately judge which interpretation was correct. But for now uncertainty reigned. In the silence of her unmarked grave, Anne Boleyn had found the peace that had eluded her in life. The woman who had risen from minor nobility to wear the crown of England, who had captivated a king and changed the course of religious history, was now beyond the reach of earthly ambition and political maneuvering. Her story had ended, but her legend was just beginning, destined to fascinate and inspire generations yet unborn. The days following Anne's execution brought a strange quiet to the English court. Those who had witnessed her death found themselves reluctant to speak of what they had seen, as if the enormity of the event had left them temporarily speechless. The execution of a crowned queen was unprecedented in English history, and no one quite knew how to process the implications of what had occurred on that May morning at the Tower of London. Henry VIII moved forward with his plans for remarriage with unseemly haste, as if desperate to put the entire Anne Boleyn episode behind him. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The contrast between this quiet wedding and the elaborate celebrations that had marked his marriage to Anne could not have been more stark, reflecting perhaps the king's desire to avoid drawing attention to the circumstances that had made this new union possible. Jane Seymour entered her role as England's third queen with apparent serenity, but she must have been acutely aware of the fate that had befallen her predecessor. She had served in Anne's household, and had witnessed firsthand the dramatic transformation of a beloved queen into a condemned traitor. This knowledge would undoubtedly influence her approach to queenship, encouraging the submissive demeanor that would characterize her brief reign. The European reaction to Anne's execution continued to develop over the weeks and months that followed. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, expressed satisfaction at what he saw as divine justice finally being served. However, even he was troubled by the precedent of executing a crowned queen, recognizing that such actions could destabilize the entire concept of royal marriage and legitimate succession throughout Europe. Francis I of France, who had generally supported Anne's cause during the divorce proceedings, found himself in a difficult position. He had hoped that Anne's influence would maintain the Anglo-French alliance against Habsburg power, but her death now left Henry more isolated and potentially more dangerous. French diplomats began reassessing their relationship with England, uncertain about the stability of a monarchy that could dispose of queens with such apparent ease. The religious implications of Anne's death were equally complex. Protestant reformers across Europe mourned the loss of one of their most prominent supporters, recognizing that her execution represented a significant setback for their cause. Anne had been instrumental in promoting reformist ideas at the English court, and her death left a void that would take years to fill. Her extensive library of reformist texts was quietly dispersed, with some volumes reportedly destroyed to avoid any association with the disgraced queen. Meanwhile, Catholic observers saw Anne's execution as divine retribution for her role in England's break with Rome. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered in churches across Catholic Europe, and there was renewed hope that Henry might be persuaded to return to the papal fold. These hopes were encouraged by the news of his marriage to Jane Seymour, who was known for her orthodox religious views and her loyalty to the memory of Catherine of Aragon. The common people of England struggled to understand the rapid changes that had transformed their royal family. Many had never fully accepted Anne as their legitimate queen, continuing to regard Catherine of Aragon as Henry's true wife even after the divorce. Yet the execution of any queen was a shocking event that raised disturbing questions about the nature of royal authority and the security of marriage itself. In the months following Anne's death, stories began to circulate about her final hours that would eventually become part of English folklore. Her courage on the scaffold, her dignified bearing throughout her imprisonment, and her final words of forgiveness toward Henry all contributed to a growing sense that perhaps an injustice had been done. These stories spread through London's taverns and marketplaces, passed from person to person with the embellishments that such tales inevitably acquire. The legal establishment that had participated in Anne's trial found themselves in an uncomfortable position as the initial shock of the proceedings wore off. Many lawyers and judges privately harbored doubts about the evidence that had been presented, recognizing that the case against the Queen had been built largely on circumstantial evidence and forced confessions. However, few were willing to voice these concerns publicly, understanding that to question the validity of the proceedings would be to challenge the King's judgment. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had declared Anne's marriage to Henry invalid just days before her execution, faced particular scrutiny. He had been one of Anne's earliest supporters and had personally conducted her wedding ceremony. His role in annulling the marriage he had originally blessed raised questions about his integrity and his willingness to subordinate religious principle to political expediency. The Boleyn family's rapid fall from grace continued to reverberate through the English nobility. Thomas Boleyn, stripped of his titles and offices, retired to his estates in disgrace. His political career effectively ended by his children's fate. The family name became synonymous with overreaching ambition and its inevitable consequences, serving as a cautionary tale for other nobles who might be tempted to aim too high. The network of clients and supporters that had surrounded the Boleyn family during their years of power quickly melted away, leaving former allies scrambling to distance themselves from the disgraced faction. This rapid abandonment of the Boleyns demonstrated the ruthlessly pragmatic nature of Tudor court politics, where loyalty was always conditional and survival depended on the ability to read and adapt to changing circumstances. Anne's daughter Elizabeth, now officially illegitimate, remained at Hunsdon House, under the care of devoted servants who continued to treat her with the respect due to a king's daughter, regardless of her legal status. The little girl was too young to understand the dramatic changes that had affected her life, but those who cared for her recognized that her future remained uncertain and would depend entirely on her father's whims and the political circumstances of the realm. Lady Bryan, Elizabeth's governess, found herself in the difficult position of caring for a child whose status had been fundamentally altered overnight. She wrote to Thomas Cromwell, requesting guidance on how to treat Elizabeth, noting that she was unsure whether the girl should still be addressed as a princess or simply as the king's daughter. This uncertainty reflected the broader confusion about Elizabeth's place in the royal succession and her prospects for the future. The household expenses for Elizabeth's care became a source of bureaucratic confusion as officials struggled to determine the appropriate level of support for a child who was no longer technically royal. Should she maintain the elaborate household befitting a princess, or should her circumstances be reduced to reflect her new status as an illegitimate daughter? These practical questions had significant implications for Elizabeth's upbringing and education. Despite the uncertainty surrounding her status, Elizabeth's education continued under the guidance of some of England's finest scholars. Her tutors recognized her exceptional intelligence and continued to provide her with a classical education appropriate for a child of royal blood. This decision would prove prescient, as the knowledge and skills Elizabeth acquired during these formative years would later serve her well when she ultimately ascended to the throne. The international marriage market that had previously included Elizabeth as a valuable commodity was now effectively closed to her. Foreign princes who might once have sought her hand as a way of securing alliance with England were no longer interested in a bastard daughter with no claim to succession. This diplomatic isolation would remain a factor throughout Elizabeth's youth, though it would ultimately prove liberating when she became queen in her own right. The Church of England, which Anne had done so much to support during its early years, continued to develop along the lines she had favored. The reformist texts she had promoted continued to circulate among educated clergy and laypeople, ensuring that her influence on English religious development survived her physical death. In this sense, Anne's legacy proved more durable than her enemies had hoped, as the ideas she had championed took root and flourished despite her absence. The artistic and cultural renaissance that had begun to flourish at the English court during Anne's time as queen suffered a temporary setback following her execution. Many of the poets, musicians, and scholars who had enjoyed her patronage found themselves seeking new sources of support, while others simply retired from court life entirely. The vibrant intellectual atmosphere that had characterized the early 1530s gave way to a more cautious and conservative cultural environment. The Tower of London itself became the subject of increased scrutiny and superstition following Anne's execution. Servants and guards reported strange occurrences in the area around Tower Green, leading to whispered stories about the ghost of the executed queen. While such tales were likely products of guilty consciences and overactive imaginations, they reflected the profound psychological impact that Anne's death had on those who had witnessed it. The scaffold where Anne had died was quickly dismantled and its components scattered, as if the authorities hoped to erase all physical evidence of the execution. However, the memory of what had occurred there proved more difficult to eliminate. Tower Green would forever be associated with Anne Boleyn's final moments, becoming one of the most famous execution sites in English history. The international community of merchants and diplomats who resided in London found themselves reassessing their relationships with the English court. The execution of a queen suggested a level of political instability that could threaten commercial interests and diplomatic agreements. Some began to hedge their bets by strengthening ties with other European powers, while others adopted a wait-and-see approach to determine whether Henry's actions represented a temporary aberration or a fundamental change in English governance. The University of Cambridge, where many of the scholars who had supported religious reform in England had been educated, faced pressure to distance itself from the ideas associated with Anne Boleyn. Several professors who had openly supported reformist theology found their positions threatened, while the curriculum was quietly adjusted to reflect more orthodox religious views. This academic retreat represented a broader intellectual retrenchment that followed Anne's death. The English Bible translation project that Anne had supported continued despite her death, though with reduced royal enthusiasm. The work of scholars like William Tyndale, whose English New Testament had been championed by Anne, remained influential among reformist clergy. However, the project now proceeded with greater caution, as its supporters were acutely aware that association with Anne's memory could prove dangerous. The financial implications of Anne's execution extended far beyond the immediate costs of the legal proceeding. The redistribution of Boleyn properties and the dissolution of Anne's household created opportunities for some courtiers, while devastating others. The crown seized significant assets that had been granted to the family during their years of favor, adding to the royal treasury but also serving as a reminder of how quickly royal generosity could be reversed. The marriage negotiations that had been underway between various European courts and members of the Boleyn family were abruptly terminated following the execution. These diplomatic connections, which had once seemed so promising for advancing English interests abroad, now became liabilities that had to be carefully managed to avoid further complication. The broader European nobility began to view marriage alliances with the English court as potentially dangerous ventures. The religious houses that Anne had supported during her time as queen found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Her patronage had provided protection for several reformist institutions, and her death left them vulnerable to more conservative influences at court. Some adapted by moderating their positions, while others faced closure or forced reformation of their practice. The legal precedents established by Anne's trial would have lasting implications for English jurisprudence. The use of circumstantial evidence and testimony extracted under duress to secure convictions in cases of high treason set dangerous precedents, that would be invoked in later political trials. The speed with which the proceedings had been conducted also established expectations for the swift resolution of cases that threatened royal interests. The psychological impact on Henry VIII himself remained largely hidden from public view, but court observers noted subtle changes in the king's behavior following Anne's execution. He seemed more suspicious of those around him, more prone to sudden changes of mood, and less tolerant of any behavior that might be construed as disloyal. These character changes would become more pronounced over time, contributing to the increasingly tyrannical atmosphere of his later reign. The coronation regalia that Anne had worn during her ceremony in 1533 was quietly stored away, too valuable to destroy but too controversial to be used again immediately. These symbols of her brief queenship served as silent reminders of her remarkable rise and dramatic fall, waiting in storage for the day when they would crown another queen. The crown itself would eventually be worn by Jane Seymour, but with considerably less ceremony and public celebration. The diplomatic dispatches that reported Anne's execution to courts across Europe became important historical documents, providing detailed contemporary accounts of the proceedings. These reports, written by trained observers for the information of their masters, offer some of the most reliable evidence we have about Anne's final days and the circumstances surrounding her death. Their consistent portrayal of her courage and dignity helped establish the narrative that would dominate historical assessments of her character. As summer arrived in England, bringing with it the warmth and abundance that Anne would never again experience, the immediate crisis of her execution began to fade into memory. The government continued to function, trade resumed its normal patterns, and life in London returned to something approaching normalcy. Yet beneath this surface calm, profound changes had been set in motion that would influence English history for generations to come. The seeds of religious and political transformation that Anne had helped to plant continued to grow in the English soil, nourished by the ideas she had promoted and the precedents her reign had established. Though she was gone, the forces she had helped to unleash would continue to shape England's development long after her voice had been silenced forever. In death, as in life, Anne Boleyn remained a catalyst for change, her legacy extending far beyond the brief span of her earthly existence. The evening shadows fell once again across Tower Green, bringing to a close another day in the long history of this ancient fortress. The stones that had witnessed Anne's final moments settled back into their eternal silence, bearing their secrets with the patience of centuries. In her unmarked grave nearby, the woman who had changed England forever rested at last, her tumultuous life finally stilled but her story destined to resonate through all the ages yet to come.